Hey Queens, Ali here. I poured my heart into writing this story because it's about my faith, and I hope you enjoyed this one.
Dear God, keep us safe. Keep the airplane safe. Direct the pilot on what to do. And please, save the man behind me. Please keep Mummy safe too.
The plane dropped. Not the gentle dip passengers feel over clouds, but a violent, stomach-emptying plunge that sent a food cart crashing into a bulkhead 3 rows up. A woman's magazine flew out of her hands and hovered, weightless, for one impossible second before slapping against the ceiling. Gomi Nam's laptop slid off his tray table. He caught it out of instinct, the same reflex that had closed a billion-dollar acquisition without a single word of hesitation 3 months earlier. But his hand was shaking. He noticed that before he noticed anything else, his own hand, betraying him. Overhead, the seatbelt sign blinked amber, then red, then began to shriek in a rhythm that felt personal, like it was screaming directly into his ear. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling in unison, a row of small yellow ghosts swinging on their tubes. Somewhere behind him, a child began to wail, and a man's voice, thick with the particular calm people use when they are trying not to panic anyone, including themselves, said, it's okay, breathe with me." A flight attendant moved down the aisle gripping seatbacks, her professional smile cracking at the corners. Mi Nam watched her mouth the safety instructions on autopilot while her eyes kept darting toward the cockpit door, and he understood, with the clarity of a man who read people for a living, that she did not know what was happening either. He turned to the window. The wing, that vast gray fin of aluminum he had glanced at maybe once during boarding and never thought about again, was disappearing. Not breaking. Disappearing, swallowed whole by a wall of black cloud that seemed to be devouring the aircraft in slow, deliberate bites. Lightning flickered somewhere inside that darkness like a nerve firing. His phone, still logged into the deal room, still open to a spreadsheet worth more than most people's lifetimes, slid off his lap and vanished under the seat in front of him. He didn't reach for it. Beside him, the seat that had been empty for exactly 19 minutes, since its occupant excused herself for what she called one more bathroom trip, I promise, was no longer empty of motion. The little girl in it, maybe 6, in a yellow cardigan with a strawberry embroidered crooked on the pocket, was climbing up onto her knees. Mi Nam's first thought was irritation. A pure, reflexive irritation, the kind he usually reserved for underperforming quarterly reports. The plane is falling out of the sky and this child wants to play. Sit down, he said, more sharply than he meant to. Seatbelt. She didn't answer him. She turned to face her seat back, small knees pressing into the cushion, and clasped her hands together in front of her chest the way children do in picture books about church, a gesture so old-fashioned it looked almost staged. She closed her eyes. She began to pray. Not loudly. Not the theatrical, sobbing prayers he'd occasionally seen in movies. Her voice was barely above the noise of the cabin, steady in a way that made the hairs on his arm rise, because everyone else on this aircraft, grown adults, executives, a man in a Rolex 3 rows up who was visibly crying, had lost the plot of themselves. And this 6-year-old had found a script. Stop that, Mi Nam said. He didn't know why it bothered him so much. Later, lying awake in a hotel room 11 floors above Singapore, he would try to explain it to himself and fail. You're making it worse. She opened one eye. Worse how? He gestured vaguely at her hands, at the whole tableau of her, kneeling and calm while the plane bucked beneath them like something alive and furious. This isn't going to help. I'm not doing it to help the plane, she said, with the patient tone of someone explaining something obvious to a slow adult. I'm doing it because I'm scared. That, at least, made sense to him. He could work with fear. Fear he understood. Fear was the resting state of every boardroom he'd ever sat in, dressed up in better suits. Then be scared, he said. Just be scared quietly. He can't hear you if you're not scared quietly, she said, and closed her eyes again. Who? God. The word landed strangely in the pressurized air, small and sharp, like a paper cut he hadn't felt happen yet. He can't hear you, Mi Nam said. The plane lurched again, hard enough that his shoulder slammed into the armrest, hard enough that the flight attendant 3 rows back dropped to her knees in the aisle and stayed there, gripping a seat leg with both hands. Because he's not out there. The girl turned her head and looked at him, really looked, the unhurried, assessing look of a child deciding whether an adult was worth listening to. Why? He pointed upward, toward the ceiling, toward the 10,000 feet of screaming black cloud above the fuselage, toward nothing. Because there's nothing out there. Just weather. Just physics. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and he hated that it did. That's all this is. She considered this the way she might consider a strange bug she'd found on a windowsill, with curiosity, not fear. Then she said, "My mommy says he doesn't have to be out there." The plane dropped again, a stomach vaulting few feet, and somewhere a bin popped open and spilled someone's duty-free bag into the aisle, a bottle of something amber rolling and shattering against a shoe. "He can be right here," the girl finished, and pressed one small hand flat against her own chest, over the strawberry on her cardigan, over her heart. Then she closed her eyes again, and this time she didn't open them. Her lips moved without sound. Mi-nam watched her shoulders, waiting for them to shake with sobs the way every other passengers were shaking. They didn't. They were still. Stiller than his own hands, which he realized were gripping the armrest hard enough to whiten his knuckles. He told himself it was shock. Children processed fear strangely. He'd read that somewhere, in some article his assistant had once forwarded about parenting during crises, back when he still pretended to read things his assistant forwarded about parenting. The plane screamed through another pocket of turbulence, and this time the overhead compartments began to rattle open one by one down the length of the cabin like a row of dominoes, spilling jackets and bags into the aisle, and somewhere near the front someone was praying out loud now too, in a different language, a man's voice, urgent and cracking. Mi-nam closed his eyes. He didn't pray. He didn't know how anymore, if he ever had, not really, not since the one time it had mattered and the answer had been no. But he found himself, despite everything, listening. Not to the plane. Not to the screaming. To the girl's silence, which had a shape to it, a texture, something he could almost call peace if he allowed himself the word. Then, nothing. It didn't taper off. It didn't gradually smooth the way turbulence sometimes does, the pilot easing the aircraft into calmer air by degrees. It stopped. All at once, mid-shudder, as if some enormous hand had simply closed around the plane and held it steady. The overhead bins stopped swinging. The oxygen masks dangled motionless, no longer swaying. The child's magazine, which had been pinned to the ceiling by G-force a moment before, fell and landed with a soft, almost comical slap on an empty tray table. Silence spread through the cabin in a wave, passenger by passenger, as though no one trusted it yet. Then the intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain said, and his voice had the particular hollowness of a man who had, seconds ago, genuinely not known if he would get to say this sentence. The aircraft has regained stability. We're clear of the weather system. I apologize for that. Please remain seated while the crew assesses the cabin." A ragged, disbelieving cheer broke out somewhere near the back. The man who had been crying laughed instead, a wet, startled laugh, and pressed both hands over his face. Mi-nam didn't move. He stared at the little girl. She opened her eyes, unclasped her hands, and looked entirely unsurprised, the way a person looks when a bus arrives exactly on schedule. "See," she said, settling back into her seat and reaching for the seat belt she'd never actually undone. "He heard me." Mi-nam opened his mouth to say something about coincidence, about pressure systems and wind shear and the 1,000 documented, rational, fundable explanations for turbulence beginning and turbulence ending, and found that nothing came out. Because somewhere underneath his ribs, in a place he had spent 6 years bricking over one meeting at a time, something had cracked. Not broken. Cracked, the way a foundation cracks quietly, long before anyone notices the walls have started to lean. He heard, unbidden and unwelcome, a voice that wasn't the girl's. A voice from a hospital corridor he had not let himself remember in years, saying the same 3 words she used to say every night before dinner, the words he used to roll his eyes at, the words he would have given every one of his fortune to hear one more time. "God loves you." He turned back to the window. The clouds outside had gone from black to a soft, indifferent gray, backlit by a sun that had apparently been there the entire time, waiting behind the storm like it had never doubted it would win. The little girl was humming now, something wordless and tuneless, swinging her feet under the seat like nothing at all had happened. Like the sky hadn't just tried to kill 300 people and then, for reasons no engineer would ever be able to explain to him, changed its mind. Mi Nam picked his phone up off the floor. The deal room spreadsheet was still open, numbers waiting patiently for his attention, the biggest acquisition of his career sitting 3 inches from his thumb. He didn't look at it. He looked, instead, at the strawberry on a stranger's cardigan, and at the small, calm hands that had folded themselves together in the middle of the end of the world, and he had the distinct, unwelcome sensation of a man who had built an empire on the belief that he controlled everything, discovering that somewhere over open water, something else entirely had been holding the plane up. If you're watching this and you've ever felt that exact feeling, the ground moving under something you thought was solid, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Because what happens next in Mi Nam's life is going to test every single thing he thinks he knows about who's really in control. Stay with me. Before we go further into this story, if you're new here, welcome, hit subscribe, because this journey is only getting more emotional from here. Mi Nam owned 4 companies, a fleet of cars he rarely drove, a private jet he used more than his own bed, and a mansion on the outskirts of Seoul with 11 rooms that stayed dark most nights because no one bothered turning on lights in rooms nobody used. He was, by every measurable standard, a man who had won. Forbes had run his photograph twice. Analysts used his acquisitions as case studies in business schools he'd never attended because he'd dropped out of the one he had. Employees rehearsed what they were going to say to him before meetings the way soldiers rehearse what they'll say before an inspection, not because he was cruel, but because he had a way of hearing exactly what wasn't being said, and that was somehow worse than cruelty. And in the east wing of that 11-room house, 2 7-year-old girls were doing the exact same thing. He sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor with a piece of paper in her lap, mouthing words silently, her lips moving through the sentence again and again until it came out smooth. She had gotten first place in her class reading competition that afternoon. She had practiced telling her father about it 11 times since school ended, timing herself, trying to find the version of the sentence that wouldn't make him check his watch. Her twin, Mi Soo, had no such patience for rehearsal. She burst through the door already talking, waving a drawing of a horse that was meant to be a self-portrait for reasons she alone understood, and demanded her sister hurry up because dinner was starting and their father had actually said, out loud, that morning, that he would be there. He was not there. He arrived 40 minutes into a dinner made for him, his tie already loosened, his phone still lit in his hand, murmuring an apology to his own mother that had the practiced cadence of a man who had delivered that particular apology many times before. Madame Go, 71 years old and sharper than every board member her son employed, did not look up from cutting Misa's food. They waited, was all she said. I know. You always know. He sat down. He had already folded her piece of paper into a small, careful square and slid it into her pocket. She would tell him about the reading competition another time, she decided. A better time. A time that, if she was being honest with the parts of herself too young to have language for it yet, she suspected would never quite arrive. That was the shape of Mi Nam's household. Love that existed, undeniably, but arrived late, tie loosened, apologizing. It had not always been this way. There had been a version of Mi Nam who came home on time because home was where the only person alive who wasn't afraid of him lived. A woman named Ariam who used to fold her hands together before every single meal, eyes closed, murmuring 3 words of thanks over rice that Mi Nam, back then a rising executive with more ambition than patience, would tease her about relentlessly. You're thanking someone for food I bought, he used to say, grinning, buttering bread he didn't need to butter because he liked watching her roll her eyes at him. I'm thanking someone for you, she would answer, and kiss the side of his head before sitting down, which was a much harder thing to arrange. He used to tell her that spreadsheets could solve any problem given enough time and enough data. She used to tell him that some problems weren't spreadsheet problems, they were on your knees problems, and he used to laugh, not unkindly, never unkindly, that was the thing people forgot about their marriage, that his disbelief and her faith had never once been a war between them. It had been a conversation. A long, warm, ongoing conversation between two people who loved each other more than they needed to agree with each other. He did not lose a miserable marriage. He lost his entire climate. His weather. The one place on Earth where the temperature had always, unfailingly, been exactly right. The night she went into labor with the twins, Minam was in a boardroom 2 floors above the one he'd later inherit, closing what would become, in hindsight, an almost embarrassingly small deal. He left mid-sentence when the call came. He does not remember the drive to the hospital. He remembers the hallway, its specific shade of pale green, a green he has since had removed from every building he owns, a green he cannot look at even now without his hands going cold. Complications, the doctor said. A word that swallowed hours whole. For the first time in his adult life, Minam discovered a problem money could not accelerate, could not buy its way around, could not out-negotiate. He paced that pale green hallway making promises to a God he had spent a decade politely ignoring, the way a man makes promises to a stranger holding something he desperately wants back. If she makes it out of that room alive, he thought, gripping the frame of a door he wasn't allowed through, I'll know you're real. I'll believe every word she's ever said. I'll fold my hands too. The twins were born alive, red-faced and furious at the world in the specific way newborns are furious, 2 small identical bodies handed to nurses who moved with the particular calm that meant something else in the room had gone wrong. Ariam did not survive the hour. Minam has never told anyone, not his mother, not his closest friends, not the therapist he saw exactly twice and never returned to, what he did in the 15 minutes after they told him. He has never described the sound he made, alone in a stairwell, a sound that didn't feel like it came from him so much as through him. What he did afterward, everyone knew, because everyone watched it happen in real time. He stopped praying that week. He stopped setting foot near anything that resembled a church within the month. And within the year, at a shareholders' dinner, slightly too much wine loosening something in him that was usually welded shut, he told a table of investors that religion was a coping mechanism for people who couldn't accept how indifferent the universe actually was, and he said it with enough conviction, enough cold clarity, that nobody at that table ever brought the subject up around him again. His daughters grew up in a house with no prayers before meals. No mention of the word God, except as something their father occasionally used the way other men used curse words, sharp, dismissive, closing a conversation rather than opening one. Which was exactly the household go Minam carried onto a plane bound for Singapore. 7 years later, the night turbulence nearly tore the aircraft out of the sky and a stranger's 6-year-old daughter folded her hands the exact way his wife used to. He landed the next morning changed in a way he could not yet name, jet-lagged and hollowed out, and walked directly into the largest acquisition meeting of his career, the deal that had brought him across an ocean in the first place, the deal his board had spent 4 months preparing for, the deal that was supposed to be the simplest part of his entire week. Preston Carter Technologies. A mid-sized firm with an outsized reputation, built by a man who had died 18 months earlier and left it, inexplicably, in the hands of a widow with no background in tech and, according to every report Minam's team had compiled, absolutely no interest in running it. Which should have made this the easiest negotiation of his life. He walked into the glass-walled conference room on the 40th floor already composing the terms in his head, already certain of exactly how this meeting would go, the way he was certain of most rooms he entered. Then the door opened, and a woman walked in wearing not a boardroom suit but a simple gray dress, her hair pulled back loosely, a folder tucked under one arm that she hadn't even opened yet, and something about the unhurried way she crossed the room told him, half a second before she spoke, that this was not going to be the meeting his team had prepared him for. She extended her hand. "Selene Carter," she said. "I understand you've come a long way for this." He shook her hand and opened his mouth to begin the pitch his team had rehearsed for weeks, and stopped, because she was looking at him with an expression he recognized instantly and could not immediately place, an expression it would take him the rest of the week to understand. It was the exact same look the little girl on the plane had given him. Like she already knew something about him that he hadn't figured out yet. "Before we start," Selene said, setting the unopened folder gently on the table between them, "I should tell you something that's going to change what you came here for." She hadn't opened the folder yet. She wasn't going to need to. I'm not selling you a company, Selene said. I'm giving one away. There's a difference, and I need you to understand it before you sign anything. Mi-nam's team had spent 4 months modeling this acquisition. Valuation reports. Growth projections. A dozen contingency clauses drafted by lawyers who billed by the hour and slept even less than he did. Nowhere in 4 months of preparation had anyone accounted for the woman across the table smiling at him like she'd already won an argument he hadn't realized they were having. The terms my office sent over were fair, he said carefully. Generous, actually. They were, she agreed. That's not what I mean. She finally opened the folder. Inside, instead of counterterms or revised numbers, was a single photograph, a man with kind, tired eyes and Selene's same unhurried smile, standing in front of a modest building with a hand-painted sign Mi-nam couldn't quite read from across the table. My husband built this company from a garage, she said. You've read the story, I'm sure. Everyone has. What nobody puts in the press releases is what he built alongside it. She turned the photograph so Mi-nam could see it properly. A foundation. Scholarships, mostly. Kids from nowhere, the way he came from nowhere. He funded it quietly for 11 years. Almost nobody knew, including most of his own board. And you're selling the company to fund it faster. I'm selling the company because I don't want it, she said, and there was no bitterness in the sentence, no performance either, just fact, delivered the way a person states their own height. I never wanted the company. I wanted my husband. The company was just the thing he loved that wasn't me. Mi-nam sat back. In every negotiation of his career, sentiment was leverage, something to be identified, priced, and used. He waited for the pivot, the moment she'd tell him what she actually wanted in exchange for the story. It didn't come. You could have been worth billions, he said instead, testing her, if you'd kept it and grown it with time. Preston built something rare. Most people don't walk away from that. Selene tilted her head slightly, amused, the way a teacher looks at a bright student who's still gotten the question wrong. I was already rich. I don't think you understand what this company is worth. I understand exactly what it's worth, she said. I just don't think you and I are measuring the same thing. He assumed, in the half-second before she continued, that she meant something spiritual, something soft, the kind of sentence that made for a nice quote in a magazine profile and nothing else. He was already composing his polite, patient reply, the one he gave people who confused meaning with money, the one that let him keep his advantage. Preston would have wanted me to do this, she went on. Not the sale, exactly. The giving. He used to say a company is just a story you tell people so they trust you with their time. He didn't build Carter Technologies to build a company. He built it so he'd have something to hand to people who needed a door opened for them. She closed the folder gently, like she was closing a Bible after a passage she'd read 100 times before. I'm not finishing his company. I'm finishing his sentence. The room was very quiet. 40 floors below, Singapore moved in its ordinary, indifferent way, cranes turning against a white sky, ferries cutting through the strait, none of it caring in the slightest that a man who had never lost a negotiation in 11 years was, at that exact moment, losing one. You checked me into a suite with a view of the harbor, Selene said, changing the register of her voice entirely, lighter now, almost teasing. I assumed that was strategy. It was hospitality. It was strategy, she said, and it's fine. I'd have done the same. She stood, smoothing her dress, and for the first time since she'd entered the room, she looked less like a widow finishing her husband's sentence and more like a woman who simply found the whole enterprise of high finance a little bit funny. The papers are fair. I'll sign them. I just needed you to know what you're actually buying, because it isn't a company. It's a promise somebody else made. I'd hate for you to hold it carelessly. She left him alone in that glass room with the photograph still sitting face up on the table, Preston Carter's kind, tired eyes looking back at him, and Mi-nam sat there for 11 minutes past the meeting's scheduled end time. His assistant would mention it later, delicately, the way you mention something you're not sure your employer once mentioned, simply looking at a stranger's face and thinking about hallways the color of pale green. He signed the papers 2 days later. It was, by every metric his board cared about, an enormous win. Headlines called it visionary. His stock rose 4% on the announcement alone. He felt almost nothing. That should have troubled him more than it did. He flew home to Seoul telling himself the whole trip had simply been unusual. Turbulence, sleeplessness, an eccentric widow with a taste for parables. He buried the week under the next one, and then the one after that, the way he buried everything, stacking obligations on top of feeling until the feeling stopped being visible from the surface. 3 weeks later, on an ordinary Tuesday that gave no warning of what it was about to do to him, his daughters came home from school talking over each other, backpack still on, cheeks flushed with the specific joy of children who have found something better than a good grade. "We made a new friend," Mi Soo announced, dropping onto the kitchen island stool without asking permission, which she never did. "Her name's Eliana and she's the smartest girl in the whole class, smarter than the teacher, I think, and she has a mom who makes the best banana bread in the entire." "She sat with us at lunch," Mihi added, quieter, the way she added most things, but no less certain. "She didn't have anyone to sit with, so we asked her." Nam was only half listening, the way he was only half listening to most things that happened in his own kitchen, his attention divided between his daughters and a phone screen full of numbers that would not, in fact, disappear if he looked away from them for one conversation. "That's nice," he said, in the tone he used for most things his daughters told him, a tone that acknowledged without absorbing. "She's new," Mi Soo continued, unbothered, already moving on to describing, in exhausting detail, the friendship bracelet Eliana had made her. "Her mom just moved them here for work. Eliana says her mom used to have a different job but now she just does foundation stuff, whatever that means. Foundation like makeup, or foundation like a building? I didn't ask." "She's really nice," Mihi said. "She's not scared of anything. Not even the fire drill, and everyone's scared of the fire drill." Nam nodded, not really absorbing any of it, his mind still 40 floors up in a glass room in Singapore, still looking at a photograph of a man he'd never met. "She's the girl from Singapore," Mi Soo said, almost as an afterthought, already sliding off her stool to go find a snack. Nam's head came up so fast his neck cracked audibly. "What did you say?" Mi Soo blinked at him, surprised by the sudden weight in his voice. "Eliana. She's the girl from the plane you were telling Grandma about. The one who prayed during the storm. She told us the whole story at lunch. Some man told her God couldn't hear her and then the plane stopped shaking right after she prayed anyway. We didn't know it was your plane until she said the man was wearing a really boring gray suit and reading spreadsheets even during the scary part." Mihi giggled. "That's definitely you, Appa." Nam sat very still, his phone forgotten face down on the counter, the numbers on it no longer mattering even slightly. "She's in your class," he said slowly, needing to hear it said again, needing the sentence to hold still long enough for him to actually believe it. "The girl from the plane is in your class. At your school. Here. In Seoul." "Yeah," Mi Soo said, already halfway to the pantry, treating this as the least interesting part of the story. "Can we invite her over? Her mom seems really cool. She brought banana bread to the class party and even the teacher had, like, 3 slices." Nam did not answer right away. Because somewhere behind his ribs, in the same place that had cracked open at 30,000 feet, something was now insisting, loudly and without permission, that a coincidence this large did not have the decency to still be called a coincidence, and if it wasn't, he had absolutely no idea what to call it instead. Or what it meant that the woman making banana bread for his daughter's classroom was very likely the same woman who had stood in a glass room in Singapore and told him she was finishing her husband's sentence. The twins' birthday fell on a Saturday, and for 3 weeks leading up to it, Hee and Mi Soo waged a joint campaign so relentless that even Madame Go, who had raised Nam himself and therefore considered herself immune to childhood persistence, eventually surrendered. "Eliana has to come," Mi Soo announced, for what her father estimated was the 9th time that week, standing in the doorway of his study with her arms crossed in a pose she had clearly copied from watching him negotiate on the phone. "It's not a party without her. She's basically already family." "She's known you for a month," Nam said, not looking up from the contract he was reading, though he had read the same paragraph 4 times without absorbing a word of it. A month is a long time when you're 7, Mi, he said quietly from the hallway, and something about the flat certainty in her voice made him look up. He agreed, eventually, the way he agreed to most things his daughters wanted badly enough to ask him twice, not because he'd been convinced, but because refusing them had started to cost more than he had left in reserve. He told himself, driving to the office that week, that there was nothing strange about it. Children's classmates attended children's birthday parties. That was simply how childhood worked, a fact he was rediscovering in real time, 7 years too late to have learned it the normal way. He did not let himself think, until the morning of the party itself, about who would inevitably be dropping Eliana off. The house was strung with balloons in 2 colors, because he wanted lavender and Mi Soo wanted a color she called electric, and Madame Go had solved the standoff by ordering both without telling either twin, which meant the entryway now looked like the inside of a kaleidoscope. Nam stood near the door in a shirt his mother had ironed for him that morning, holding a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking, watching a stream of unfamiliar 7-year-olds and their parents flow through his front hall. Then the door opened again, and Selene Carter walked in holding a gift wrapped in brown paper and twine, wearing jeans and a soft green sweater instead of the boardroom gray he remembered, and for one full second, long enough that his mother, standing beside him, noticed and filed it away for later. Nam forgot he was holding a cup of coffee at all. "You," he said, which was not what he had planned to say, if he had planned anything. "Me," she agreed, matching his tone exactly, amusement flickering at the corner of her mouth. "Small world. Or small soul, at least. You didn't mention your daughter was in my daughter's class." "You didn't ask," she said simply. "And honestly, I didn't put it together myself until Eliana came home talking about twins named after flowers." She glanced past him toward the noise of the party. Hee and Mi Soo. Beautiful and graceful. Your wife chose those." The question landed gently, without weight behind it, but Nam still felt it settle somewhere it wasn't invited. "She did," he said. Selene didn't press further. She simply nodded, like the answer confirmed something she'd already suspected, and let herself be pulled deeper into the party by Eliana tugging insistently at her sleeve. For most of the afternoon, Nam did what he usually did at events like this, stood near the edges, thanked people for coming, checked his phone more than he would have admitted to. But every few minutes his attention drifted, unbidden, toward the woman crouched by the dessert table helping 3 overexcited girls not overturn an entire tray of cupcakes, laughing at something Mi Soo said with her whole face, the way people laugh when they've forgotten, briefly, to perform being fine. By the time the cake was cut and the children disappeared upstairs in a herd, he had promised Eliana a tour of her room, which had somehow expanded to include the entire 2nd floor. The party had thinned into its final, quieter hour, and Nam found himself, almost without deciding to, standing beside Selene on the back terrace, both of them holding drinks neither was really drinking. "You checked the flight records," she said, not a question. He looked at her, startled that she knew, though he supposed it made sense. He'd made no secret of asking around, quietly, through channels that weren't quite official. "How did you?" "Eliana told me a very serious businessman went and interviewed a pilot," Selene said, smiling into her glass. She thought it was very funny. "Did you find your explanation?" "No." The word came out heavier than he intended. "Wind shear that severe should have shown up on radar minutes before impact." "It didn't." "The captain has flown that route for 11 years and said he's never experienced anything close to it, before or since. There's no mechanical failure logged. No weather anomaly on record for that airspace that night." He turned his glass slowly, watching the light move through it. "I've spent my whole life trusting explanations. This one doesn't have one." "Maybe it does," Selene said. "You just don't like the one it has." He didn't answer that, and she didn't push, and for a while they simply stood there, the noise of children thundering somewhere above them through the ceiling, evening settling gold and slow over the garden. "Tell me about her," Selene said eventually. "Your wife. Ariam, wasn't it?" Nobody asked him that anymore. People asked around it, over it, near it, but never directly, as though the question itself might be contagious. He found, standing on his own terrace with a woman he'd known for exactly one negotiation and one birthday party, that he wanted to answer it. She was the only place I ever felt safe, he said, and heard his own voice do something unfamiliar on the last word, a small fracture he hadn't authorized. I built all of this, he gestured vaguely at the house, the garden, the life visible from where they stood, after her. Before her, I built things because I was hungry. After I met her, I think I mostly just wanted somewhere to bring it all home to. Selene was quiet for a moment, turning that over. Then losing her must have felt like losing your country, she said. He looked at her sharply, because that was the sentence, exactly the sentence, the one shape his grief had never found language for in 6 years of trying, and here was a stranger handing it to him fully formed, like she'd been carrying it for him the whole time and had simply been waiting for the right conversation to set it down. Yes, he said, and it came out rougher than he meant it to. That's exactly it. She didn't offer him a platitude. She didn't tell him it would get easier, or that everything happened for a reason, or any of the small mercies people usually reached for in moments like this. She simply let the sentence sit between them, true and unadorned, and somehow that was the kindest thing anyone had done for him in years. Upstairs, unheard by either of them, a very different conversation was taking place. He had pulled a folder out from under her bed, not toys, not the tour she'd promised, but a school folder, its corner worn soft from handling. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a presentation she'd given 3 days earlier, one Nam had promised to attend and then hadn't, a business call running long enough to swallow the entire afternoon whole. It was about the person I want to be like, he explained to Eliana and Mi Soo, smoothing the paper flat on the carpet. I wrote about Eliana. I don't really remember her, but Grandma told me things, and I used those. Mi Soo, who had been there for the presentation and had cried without entirely understanding why, went quiet. Did your dad see it? Eliana asked, with the simple bluntness of a child who hadn't yet learned to soften a question. He had a meeting, he said, in the practiced, neutral voice of someone who had explained this exact disappointment to herself many times already, smoothing it down until it no longer had edges. Grandma came instead. She said it was wonderful. Eliana looked at the paper, at a child's careful handwriting filling the lines, and her eyes caught on something added at the very bottom, in slightly smaller letters, as though it had been an afterthought too tender to write at full size. A single sentence he had appended after the rest of the essay was finished, one that neither Madame Go nor anyone else in the audience 3 days earlier had known to look for, tucked below a paragraph about a mother she barely remembered. Eliana read it silently, then looked up at me with an expression far older than 7. Does your dad know you wrote this part? She asked quietly. He shook her head, already reaching to fold the paper back into its careful, hidden square, the same reflex she used for every hope she'd learned not to say out loud, and downstairs, at that exact moment, unaware that his daughter's folder even existed, Nam was hearing Selene Carter say something that would make the rest of his evening, and the rest of his very carefully controlled life, considerably harder to hold together. You asked me once if I question things, Selene said, turning her glass slowly in the last of the gold evening light. Whether I ever doubted, when Preston died. You didn't ask outright, but I could hear it underneath everything else you were saying. Nam hadn't realized it had been that transparent. I wasn't trying to interrogate you. You weren't. You were trying to figure out if I was lying to myself. She said it without offense, the way she seemed to say most difficult things, plainly, like laying a card face up on a table instead of hiding it in her hand. I'll save you the trouble of asking properly. Yes. I questioned it. I still do, some days. That surprised him more than he expected it to. He had built, without quite meaning to, an image of her as a woman who had grief figured out, faith figured out, all of it filed neatly somewhere he couldn't access. It was easier to admire someone from that distance than to imagine standing beside them in the mud of it. I have a voicemail, she said, from the morning he died. He was calling to ask if I wanted anything from the market. Nothing important. I've listened to it maybe 400 times. I know I should delete it. Every grief book I've ever pretended to finish tells me to delete it, or transcribe it, or do some ceremonial thing that lets me let go of it properly. She smiled, faint and a little rueful. I haven't done any of those things. I just keep it. And some nights I ask God why I get to keep a voicemail and not a husband, and he hasn't exactly emailed me back an itemized answer. But you didn't stop believing, Mi Nam said. It wasn't quite a question. No, she said. I stopped expecting him to explain himself. Those are different things. I still go to bed angry some nights. I just don't pack a bag and leave the marriage over it. She glanced at him, steady. Faith was never supposed to mean I stopped asking questions. It just means I keep showing up to the conversation even when he doesn't answer on my schedule. Mi Nam had nothing to say to that. It sat in his chest the rest of the night, long after the last of the party guests had gone home and the balloons had started drooping toward the floor one by one, a woman's calm insistence that grief and faith weren't opposite so much as two people learning, badly and slowly, to sit in the same room together. He did not get much time to sit with it. 3 weeks later, the collapse began. It didn't arrive as a single dramatic betrayal, the kind his board members half expected and had contingency plans drawn up for. It arrived the way most real disasters do, slowly, then all at once, buried in the fine print of a decision he himself had made years earlier, back when he was building faster than he was thinking. A regulatory filing from an old subsidiary, one he'd barely glanced at when it crossed his desk 7 years prior, resurfaced in the middle of the largest cross-border acquisition his company had ever attempted, the one meant to cement his legacy on 2 continents at once. Investigators used the word irregularities. Lawyers used the word exposure. Mi Nam mostly heard, underneath all of it, the sound of something he had built with his own hands over 2 decades beginning to crack from a fault line he himself had put there. For once in his life, money didn't move fast enough to fix it. Neither did charm, nor leverage, nor the particular ruthlessness that had made him a legend in boardrooms across 3 countries. The problem simply sat there, immovable, indifferent to how many hours he threw at it. He stopped coming home for dinner. Then he stopped coming home most nights before the girls were asleep. Madame Go tried, twice, to sit him down. Both times he told her he didn't have time, in a tone that closed the conversation before it started, a tone she hadn't heard from him since the year after Ariam died. He stopped rehearsing things to tell him. She simply stopped bringing things to him at all, folding her news into small squares and handing it instead to her grandmother, who at least had time to unfold it. Selene noticed the change before he admitted it to himself. She called, twice, gently, and both times he answered in the clipped, distracted voice of a man managing a crisis rather than a man in a conversation with someone who cared about him. The 3rd time she called, he let it ring out. She came to the house instead, unannounced, on an evening he'd meant to spend alone with a stack of legal filings and a bottle of something stronger than he usually allowed himself. "You're disappearing," she said, standing in his study doorway, arms crossed, not unkindly but not softly either. "I'm handling a crisis." "You're handling it by becoming someone your daughters are afraid to talk to," she said. He told Eliana she doesn't bring good news to you anymore. She said it like it was just a fact about the weather. Not even upset about it. That's what scared me. Something in him went cold and defensive, the same reflex that had once turned a shareholders' dinner into a small, cutting sermon on the uselessness of faith. "You don't know what I'm dealing with." "I don't need to know the details to see what it's doing to you," Selene said. "You don't have to believe what I believe, Mi Nam. I've never once asked you to. But you don't get to turn your pain into permission to hurt everyone standing close enough to love you." He should have heard the truth in it. Instead he heard an accusation, and he answered it the way he answered every accusation in a boardroom, sharply, with force, aiming to win rather than to understand. "You don't get to walk into my house and tell me how to grieve my own company," he said, and regretted the words even as they left him, watching them land on her face and take something with them when they hit. Selene didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry, didn't argue back, didn't give him the fight some smaller, uglier part of him might have wanted in that moment, something to push against so he wouldn't have to feel what he was actually feeling. She simply looked at him for a long moment, the way she'd looked at him across a boardroom table months earlier, like she already knew something he hadn't figured out yet. "Call me when you remember which version of yourself you're trying to protect," she said quietly, and left. He told himself, in the days that followed, that he didn't need her, the same way he'd told himself for 6 years that he didn't need the God his wife had prayed to before every meal. He buried himself in filings and depositions and calls that stretched past midnight, and the house grew emptier in ways that had nothing to do with square footage. It was on one of those late nights, alone in his study with the wreckage of the acquisition spread across his desk, that Madame Go appeared in the doorway without knocking, holding something he hadn't seen in 6 years and had, if he was honest, spent 6 years actively avoiding. Ariam's old Bible, its cover soft with handling, a faded ribbon marking a page somewhere near the middle. "I found it while I was reorganizing the storage room," his mother said, setting it gently on the corner of his desk, careful not to disturb the papers, as though she understood exactly how much weight the small object carried compared to the stack beside it. "I wasn't going to give it to you. I've kept it hidden for years because I thought it would hurt you." She paused at the door, her hand on the frame. "But you're already hurting me, Nam. I don't think hiding things from you is helping anymore." She left him alone with it. He sat staring at the worn leather cover for a long time before he let himself reach for it, and when he finally opened it to the ribbon page, his hands, the same hands that had signed contracts worth more than small nations, the same hands that had held his newborn daughters while a hallway the color of pale green swallowed everything else he loved, were shaking harder than they had 30,000 feet above the ocean. The night a stranger's daughter taught him that some prayers get answered on a schedule nobody chooses. Tucked inside the page, in his wife's handwriting, was something he had never known existed. Inside the front cover, tucked against the spine where it had waited undisturbed for 6 years, was a single folded page in Ariam's handwriting, softer than he remembered, the ink slightly faded at the creases from being folded and unfolded more times than he'd ever know, dated 3 days before the twins were born. "If me Nam ever reads this," it began, "I hope he knows that I never asked God to make his life perfect. I only asked him to make my husband know he was loved. That's the whole prayer. That's the only thing I ever really wanted for him. Asterisk." He read it 4 times before the words stopped swimming. Somewhere in the 6 years since her death, he had built an entire theology out of a single failed bargain, asterisk save her and I'll believe asterisk, as though her death had been God's answer to a demand he never should have made in a hospital corridor at 2 in the morning. He had never once considered that her prayers for him hadn't been about outcomes at all. She hadn't been praying for a perfect husband, a safer flight, a company that never cracked at the seams. She had been praying every single night before dinner while he rolled his eyes and buttered bread he didn't need, that he would someday understand he was not alone in any of it. There was a second line beneath the first, smaller, as though she'd almost decided not to write it. Asterisk, "You always said spreadsheets could solve anything given enough time. I used to tell you some things aren't spreadsheet problems. I still believe that. I think you will too, eventually. I just won't be there to see it, and I'm sorry for that. I really am. Asterisk." He put the page down on the desk, on top of a stack of legal filings worth more than the page itself would ever be worth to anyone but him, and found that his hands were shaking harder than they had 30,000 feet above the ocean. The night a stranger's daughter had taught him that some prayers get answered on a schedule nobody chooses. He sat with it until the study window went from black to gray. When Madame Go found him there at dawn, still in yesterday's shirt, the Bible open on his knees, she didn't ask what had kept him up. She only set a cup of tea beside him, the way she used to when he was a boy, failing to hide that he'd been crying, and left without a word. He wasn't crying by then. He was simply still, in a way she hadn't seen from him since before the hallway, before the pale green paint, before any of it. He didn't become a different man overnight. That would have made for a tidier story than the one he actually lived, and by now he had learned to distrust anything that arrived tidy. His faith came back the way most true things do, in fragments, badly aimed, embarrassing in their smallness, nothing like the confident, practiced prayers his wife used to say over rice. Some mornings, before the house woke, before his phone lit up with numbers demanding his attention, he simply asked a question into the dark of his own room. "Are you there?" That was usually all he managed. Some days it felt like enough. Some days it didn't, and he said nothing further, and told himself that not knowing wasn't the same as giving up. He began noticing things he had trained himself, for 6 years, not to see. The specific pitch of Misa's laugh when she thought no one was listening, higher, less guarded, than the laugh she performed for adults. The way he still folded paper into small, careful squares whenever she had something she was afraid to say out loud, a habit he now recognized because he finally knew what to look for. He asked her about the folder one evening, gently, sitting on the floor of her room instead of standing in the doorway the way he used to. She hesitated, then pulled it out from under her bed without a word, and handed it to him like she was handing over something breakable. He read the essay slowly. Reached the smaller sentence at the bottom, the one added almost as an afterthought, asterisk and maybe my dad one day asterisk, and had to set the paper down and press the heel of his hand against his eyes before he could speak. You wrote this, he said, and you didn't tell me. I was going to, he said, watching him carefully, the way she'd learned to watch adults for signs of whether a conversation was safe to continue. I just wanted to wait for the right time. There isn't a right time, he said. There's just time. I wasted a lot of it. I'm sorry. She didn't say it was okay, and he was grateful for that, because it wasn't, not entirely, not yet, but she leaned into his side the way she used to when she was small enough to fall asleep against him during long car rides, and that was its own kind of answer. He called Selene that same night. Not to apologize with words alone, he had learned, slowly and at real cost, that words without change were just noise dressed up as remorse, but to ask if he could see her, in person, and try again, properly this time, without the armor he usually wore into difficult conversations. She met him on the same terrace where he'd once told her about a hallway the color of grief, both of them leaning against the railing instead of sitting, as if neither wanted to get too comfortable before they'd said what needed saying. I don't know how to do this, he admitted, and it cost him something to say it plainly. Admitting weakness had always cost him, ever since he was young enough to learn that weakness got exploited in every room he'd ever fought his way into. Start again. Trust something. Any of it. I don't even know which part scares me more. Neither do I, Selene said, and took his hand, unhurried, like she'd been waiting to be asked rather than rushing to offer. I've been doing this alone for a long time. I'm not sure I remember how to do it any other way. Then maybe we figure it out badly together, he said, instead of well apart. She laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and for the first time in years he laughed at something that wasn't a punchline delivered across a boardroom table to soften bad news. Their daughters had, by then, appointed themselves architects of the whole arrangement, with the transparent confidence only children possess. Mi Soo informed Eliana one afternoon, with the gravity of someone delivering market intelligence, that she suspected their parents liked each other. Eliana informed her right back that she'd suspected the same thing weeks earlier and had simply been waiting for someone else to say it first. He gasped audibly enough that Madame Go, 3 rooms away, asked what on earth was going on, and from then on the 3 of them staged a quiet campaign of dinner invitations and conveniently timed phone calls that fooled absolutely no one and charmed everyone anyway. The real test came somewhere neither faith nor romance had prepared him for. At a charity gala Nam's company hosted that autumn, in the crush of a crowded ballroom thick with perfume and clinking glassware, he slipped away from her seat to find a restroom and didn't come back. 4 minutes became 10. 10 became the worst 20 minutes of his life, worse than any boardroom collapse, worse than the pale green hallway, because this time there was no negotiation table to walk away from, no lawyers to manage the outcome, only his daughter, somewhere in a building full of strangers, and his own hands shaking exactly the way they had 30,000 feet above the ocean. He found her, finally, behind a service corridor curtain, sitting on the floor with her knees pulled to her chest, crying, not from fear of being lost, she told him later, in a voice so small he had to lean close to hear it, but from the fear that he wouldn't notice she was gone at all. He knelt on that floor in a rented tuxedo, careless of the fabric, and held her until her shaking stopped. Somewhere in the middle of it he understood, with a clarity sharper than any deal he'd ever closed, that his whole adult life had been an elaborate architecture built to prevent loss, companies, contracts, walls thrown up around his own heart, and none of it had ever once made him safe. Love couldn't be engineered against disappearing. It could only be shown up for, again and again, on ordinary days that didn't ask permission first. Months later, on a Sunday he chose without anyone asking him to, Gominam walked into a church for the first time in 7 years and sat alone in the back row. He didn't go because Selene had asked him to. She hadn't. He went because he had finally grown curious enough, and humble enough, to want to understand the God his wife had trusted without ever needing him to agree with her first. The worship began, unfamiliar and a little overwhelming, voices rising around him in a language of belief he was only beginning to relearn. He looked at the empty seat beside him and, for one unguarded moment, let himself imagine who might have been sitting there. "I still don't understand why you took her," he whispered, so quietly it barely disturbed the air. "But I'm starting to understand why she wasn't afraid." He let himself cry then, finally, without performing composure for anyone watching, without checking who might see. Selene slid into the seat beside him without a word and took his hand, steady the way she'd been steady since a glass room in Singapore, and said nothing at all, because nothing needed saying. Years passed the way years do, faster than any of them expected. The twins grew taller than their grandmother liked to admit and started rolling their eyes at her stories, which she took as evidence they were listening closely. Eliana remained, in every way that mattered, part of the family the three girls had quietly engineered into existence long before the adults caught up. Minam became a father who arrived early to school events instead of rehearsing apologies for arriving late, a man who burned pancakes on Saturday mornings with theatrical confidence and no measurable improvement, a man who prayed with his daughters before dinner the way his wife once had, badly at first, then less badly, then simply as a thing they did together without anyone thinking to comment on it anymore. One such morning, Mi Soo caught him in the kitchen with his eyes closed and his hands folded loosely over a plate of eggs. "Dad," she asked, tilting her head, "what are you asking God for?" He opened his eyes and smiled. "Nothing." She frowned, confused, exactly the way her sister used to frown at strangers on airplanes who said things she didn't understand. "Then why are you praying?" He looked at his daughters, then at Selene setting the table with Eliana, laughing at something private between them, then, for just a moment, toward the window and the ordinary gray sky beyond it. "I'm saying thank you," he said. He had once knelt in a hallway and offered God a bargain, "Save her, and I'll know you're real." It had taken him years, a stranger's daughter praying with her hands clasped over a strawberry-embroidered cardigan, a widow who refused to stop asking questions even when the answers didn't come, and his own child's handwriting at the bottom of a school essay to understand that faith was never meant to be a transaction. It was a relationship, unhurried and imperfect, the kind that survives silence and unanswered questions and still shows up the next morning to try again. And maybe the greatest miracle hadn't been a little girl's prayer stopping a plane from falling out of the sky. Maybe it was that the same prayer, years later, was still quietly bringing a broken man home.